What if the name you carry, your own family's name, hid a secret so dangerous that entire archives were emptied just to erase it? And what if beneath the worn wooden floor of a lonely Texas church, a single sealed box waited in the dark, holding the story of a bloodline altered beyond recognition? Tonight here on Sleepy History Tales, we open a file that was never meant to be opened. It is a story whispered in fragments across dusty counties and sealed court ledgers. The story of the Morrison family. Let me set the scene. It was the summer of 1952. Texas baked under a cruel drought, the power flickered in rolling shortages, and the Cold War filled even the smallest towns with quiet fear. And in the midst of all that tension, a respected family began to unravel in ways no doctor, no minister, no neighbor could explain. Their children were different. Their medical records disappeared as if someone had plucked them out of existence. And when government cars began creeping down those dirt roads in the middle of the night, the town learned to look away. Something more than simple tragedy was unfolding. Before we step into that shadow, I'd like you to do something for me. If you can pause for a heartbeat and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Are you listening in the hush of midnight or with morning light creeping around your curtains? Let us know, because the time of night changes the way these stories settle into you. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing and turning on notifications, because here, the histories we uncover are the ones hidden on purpose. These are not the stories that fill school books. They are the stories designed to stay buried. Tonight's mystery comes alive not in ghostly folklore but in hard evidence, lost journals, sealed vaults, and even modern DNA results. Remember as you listen, this is not a ghost story. This is not a campfire legend. This is a family erased by design. Their shadows stretch across generations, their names surviving only in scattered fragments. Some mysteries end with answers. Others end only with silence. The Morrisons left us with both. And tonight, we break that silence. Fast forward to the summer of 2025. A fading stone church in central Texas, its congregation long gone, stood cracked and silent against the heat. Renovation crews arrived with scaffolding and heavy machinery, tearing out rotted beams and prying up warped floorboards. It was supposed to be routine work. But beneath the choir loft, a hammer struck something that was not wood. Buried in shadow was a sealed vault. Its iron door, blistered with rust, had clearly not breathed open air in generations. The hinges fought every turn, groaning as though they themselves feared what lay inside. Workers described the silence that followed as unnatural, less like reverence, more like dread. When the door finally gave way, dust rose in thin ribbons. The smell of long confinement rolled outward, sharp and heavy. Inside waited a single wooden box, edges blackened, as though lightly scotched. Across the lid, in bold but faded lettering, one word remained clear: Morrison. Flanking the name were crude warning symbols scratched in with a hand that shook but meant every mark. No parish blueprint listed the vault. No inventory of church property mentioned any box. It should not have been there at all. And yet, someone decades ago had hidden it with unmistakable care. The box was heavier than expected. Its weight shifted oddly, as if papers and objects were layered inside, jostling against each other. Workers carried it out into the daylight, but none lingered beside it. One man swore the air around the box felt colder than the 100-degree heat outside. Another noticed that the padlock sealing the lid looked far newer than the vault itself, perhaps replaced within the last 50 years. Who had placed it there? Why was the family name presented like the title page of a forbidden book? The Morrisons, after all, were known in local memory as decent farming folk. Sunday regulars whose legacy was supposed to be nothing more than rows of crops and carved pews. Yet here was a box that suggested something carefully, deliberately entombed. When county archivists arrived, the unease only deepened. The lock's keyhole had been filled with hardened wax, making it impossible to open without breaking the seal. Metal bands reinforced the lid, hammered shut from the outside, as though the true purpose of the box was not storage, but containment. In photographs taken before removal, it seems at first glance almost ordinary, aged, wood-corroded lock, faint scratches. But zoom in and you see smears across the surface, dark stains that might once have been ink, or something far more unsettling. The church ledger from 1953 contains just a single margin note scrawled in a different hand than the rest, certain records placed beyond reach. Do not disturb. No explanation follows, and so we are left to wonder together in the soft dark of this night. What did the Morrison family carry that demanded such silence? Who chose to hide their story beneath a church floor? And why did they believe the world should never see it again? Stay with me, because the deeper we go, the more the line blurs between history and nightmare. The vault was resealed after that first discovery, though the box itself was carried carefully out into the heat for examination. Local officials hesitated, their voices hushed, as if the very walls might overhear. Should they alert the state archives? Should they risk bringing in university experts? No one wanted to invite ridicule or worse attention. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Something of consequence had been hidden here. And whoever sealed it away believed with absolute certainty that it should never ever resurface. Some secrets are buried for a reason. And in that lonely Texas church, a box carrying the Morrison name had waited more than 70 years to test the courage of those who found it. The brittle pages of parish ledgers from the early 1950s tell a quieter story, a steady rhythm of names and numbers that might have seemed unremarkable until now. The name Morrison appears again and again. Tithes paid in full, land donations accepted with gratitude, attendance noted for every holy day. In a county where families often drifted away with the fortunes of weather and crop, the Morrisons remained a fixed point on a restless horizon. They were landowners, their acreage stretching beyond the bend of the county road, where fields of sorghum and corn flanked a weathered farmhouse. Old photographs rescued from a forgotten drawer show them posed in stiff formality. Broad-shouldered men, solemn women, children dressed in clothes that seemed to resist the dust that coated their neighbors. On the surface, nothing more than a prosperous rural family. But beneath that picture of respectability lay a town already buckling under forces it could not control. The drought of the early 1950s stripped central Texas bare. Reservoirs shrank to cracked mud. Cattle starved. Wells turned brackish. Families packed their lives into trucks and drifted toward distant cities in search of work. The Morrisons did not leave. They endured. Their prosperity diminished but never collapsed. Their farmhouse stood like a stubborn landmark against a dying horizon. This resilience earned admiration. and something colder. Neighbors whispered that their fortune was unshakable, as if bound by more than careful management. Their children rarely mingled at school. On Sundays, they occupied the front pews without fail, but fellowship ended at the church doors. The family would drive home together, a slow procession of dust trailing behind, like a barrier no one dared cross. Letters exchanged between the reverend and diocesan officials reveal unease hidden between careful lines. The Morrisons' contributions kept the church solvent during the leanest years, yet their presence unsettled others. One note from 1951 records a curious impression. The air around them feels colder, as if hardship touches everyone but them. Another speaks of whispered curses when livestock perished in surrounding fields, while Morrison cattle remained strong. Photographs reinforce this sense of quiet distance. At community gatherings, the family stands together but slightly apart, their expressions rarely softening, as if the camera captured not smiles, but a legacy already weighted with shadow. A portrait of the matriarch taken in 1952 shows her seated with an infant swaddled in white, the family Bible balanced in her lap. At first glance, it is an ordinary post-war family image until the eye lingers on the baby's face. The features blur not with age, but with a strange motion or perhaps intention. To the town, the Morrisons embodied endurance. Their land withstood drought. Their pew never emptied. Their wealth provided a veneer of stability. Yet that very stability bred suspicion, a quiet conviction that misfortune deferred was misfortune transformed. The letters and notes never speak openly of fear, but their caution is unmistakable. A family admired and held at arm's length, too prosperous in a time of famine, too composed in the face of ruin. Every town shapes its legends, and in that drought-stricken Texas community, the Morrisons became one. A family both respected and quietly dreaded. Their legacy preserved not only in records and photographs, but in the heavy silence that surrounded them. The stage was set, and the unease clinging to their name would only deepen as the summer of 1952 pressed down like a sentence without reprieve. Day after day, the drought held the land in its burning grip. Reservoirs fell to dust. Wind carried the smell of scorched earth. Tempers frayed beneath skies that refused to break. Inside the county hospital, already strained by water rationing and faltering electricity, the air thickened to a damp, oppressive weight. Ceiling fans turned reluctantly, pushing heavy heat rather than cooling it. Buckets of melted ice sat in corners as a desperate substitute for relief. Nurses moved through the corridors with damp cloths around their necks, murmuring prayers against fainting spells. It was under these merciless conditions, amid drought heat and a silence that seemed to listen, that a Morrison child came into the world. The Morrisons had chosen the hospital over their own farmhouse, hoping that modern care might shield them from misfortune. Yet, when the moment of birth arrived, the room fell into a silence deeper than any storm could have brought. The infant's features startled the staff into stillness. Limbs uneven, eyes set strangely wide, skin carrying a pallor no newborn should bear. For a long heartbeat, no one moved. Only the exhausted rhythm of the mother's breathing filled the air. Nurses glanced toward the physician for guidance, their faces tight with something beyond professional concern. The doctor, trained to meet deformity, with clinical detachment, felt his composure falter. His hand shook as he made notes in the ledger, mechanical strokes that could not disguise his unease. One nurse crossed herself and whispered a prayer too soft to catch. Another turned her face away, claiming the oppressive heat had made her faint. But the heaviness in the room was more than heat. It was older than science, older than language. Something that pressed against the skin and resisted every name. Outside families waited along chipped corridors that smelled of disinfectant and damp plaster. Word moved faster than the doctor's careful steps. First in whispers, then in murmurs. A single phrase traveled the length of the hallway. The Morrison baby is not right. By the time the doctor emerged to speak, his strained assurances could not stop the seed of unease from rooting in every ear. In a town already frayed by crop failures and parched wells, the birth felt less like a medical anomaly than an omen. Parish notes from that summer record only questions, never answers. A mark upon the family, one margin entry reads without further explanation. Letters exchanged between nurses in the weeks that followed describe sleepless nights. They write of the baby's breathing ragged, unnatural, more like the wind than a voice. Rumors soon claimed that the attending physician had locked his own notes away, unwilling to expose them to the wider medical community. And in a time when polio wards in Amarillo overflowed and epidemics blurred the line between natural misfortune and divine judgment, the Morrison birth carried a different, heavier weight. The staff avoided words like mutation or syndrome. Instead, they spoke in whispers of curses. Electricity flickered through the hospital that summer, plunging the ward into pockets of oppressive darkness. And in that small delivery room, the Morrison family's legacy of dread began with a child whose first breath carried the silence of an entire town. Among the scattered remnants of county records lies a bundle of private pages, unfiled, unsigned, and stained by sweat and ink. They belong to Dr. Samuel Harlan, a Baylor-trained physician assigned to the rural hospital during those dry, punishing years. Young, ambitious, eager to bring modern medicine to a region that often leaned more on prayer than on science. Harlan entered the summer of 1952 believing in reason. The Morrison birth soon drove that belief into uneasy silence. His first entry reads, measured, almost reassuring. He describes the newborn as presenting multiple congenital malformations, citing rare syndromes by names drawn from distant textbooks. The handwriting hesitates in places, betraying doubt. But he writes as though a diagnosis might impose order on chaos. The second entry darkens. Another Morrison child is born within months, this one marked by deformities unlike the first. No clear resemblance to known pattern, Harlan notes. In the margins, he underlines single words again and again, aberrant, inexplicable, unclassified. By the third case, desperation seeps through his careful phrasing. Harlan begins corresponding with colleagues in Amarillo, where polio wards have turned physicians into reluctant experts on unusual afflictions. He sends discreet descriptions carefully edited to protect the family's name and asks whether they have seen anything similar. The replies are brief, almost dismissive. Not polio, one letter states flatly. Another advises psychiatric evaluation, hinting that the family's troubles might be imagined rather than inherited. No one offers an explanation. Isolation closes in. Harlan begins writing late at night, long after patients have left and the corridors have emptied. Candle wax stains the margins of his pages. His handwriting tightens. His tone shifts from detached to troubled. An anomaly not explained by science, he scrolls but equally unfit for superstition. He starts cataloguing not only physical traits, but sounds the strained rhythm of an infant's breath, the uneven pattern of its sleep, the absence of the sharp cries that other newborns produce without effort. His language begins to fracture. If inherited, one entry warns it follows no Mendelian law. If contagious, it finds no host beyond their blood. He confesses a growing fear that even documenting these births might endanger him, though he offers no clear reason why. Ethical questions shadow every page. Should he report his findings to state health authorities? Should he protect the family's privacy and risk the unknown? Each option carries its own peril. He notes that church elders prefer silence and that the county board will do almost anything to avoid attracting outside scrutiny. By late 1952, his pen trembles across the page. To name it, he writes, is to pretend to understand it. To describe it is to spread its shadow. And then the entries stop. The words begin like a physician's careful notes. But listen closely, and you'll hear how they drift towards something darker. The language of dread. What should have been a clinical report becomes, page by page, a quiet record of disintegration. Not of the patients, but of the man who was meant to care for them. The bundle of notes ends without ceremony. The final page is a half-written sentence. If this was a disease the doctor seemed to whisper it was never meant to be. The ink trails off into a smeared shadow, as if even the thought itself refused to be finished. Do you ever wonder what makes a hand stop mid-word, as though something unseen had entered the room? The Morrison homestead once stood like a landmark of steadiness in a county beaten dry by endless drought. Neighbors remembered the warmth of barn raisings, the laughter of harvest suppers, how the Morrison family always gave more than most. But after the year 1952, the rhythm of communal life began to change. The first whispers rose from the church pews, those same wooden benches where families once sat shoulder to shoulder. Now the sermons bent toward judgment. Words meant for everyone began to feel aimed at a single row. The wages of sin, the preacher intoned, and the phrase seemed to settle like a stone when the Morrisons entered the sanctuary. Attendance faltered. Where once the congregation overflowed, gaps began to appear. Mothers pulled children closer when the Morrison family walked the aisle. Men exchanged glances during prayer, their soft amens carrying unease instead of faith. In a town where the church anchored both spirit and society, to lose standing there was to lose it everywhere. Beyond the sanctuary, suspicion sharpened. At the general store, conversation stopped when a Morrison stepped through the door. Bags of seed sacks of flour rung up quickly, coins exchanged with only the words required. On front porches, neighbors leaned close, repeating stories of births they had never seen but swore were true. Children, they said, were born without sound. Infants who never cried. Eyes that looked not at you but through you. Can you picture such eyes in the dim glow of a kerosene lamp? The drought deepened the resentment. Wells across the county failed. Fields cracked. Herds thinned to bone. Yet the Morrison farm still produced enough to sustain them. Whether through careful planning or stubborn luck, they fared better than most. Endurance once admired now seemed unnatural. Some called it a blessing turned inward, others whispered of a curse spilling outward. Either way, it set them apart. Parish notes from 1953 show a decline in collective offerings, though Morrison contributions remained steady. Reverend Yindos Everand, caught between gratitude and fear of losing his flock, sharpened his sermons. He spoke of hidden sins, of burdens carried by families who would not confess, of divine justice handed down through generations. He never named the Morrisons, but no one doubted who his words pursued. At school, Morrison children sat alone. Teachers reported no misbehavior. Yet, classmates avoided them as if proximity itself carried risk. On playgrounds, games ended the moment a Morrison joined. Some parents quietly withdrew their children, choosing distance over chance. What began as private doubt hardened into social law. The Morrisons were to be endured, but never embraced. Invitations ceased. Hands went unshaken. Doors closed early when their carriage rattled down the road. Their isolation became complete, not by decree, but by consensus. There were no formal accusations, no charges, no public confrontation. Yet the silence pressed heavier than any verdict. To be spoken of only in whispers, prayed over only as warning, was to live in exile, inside one's own town. And in drought-stricken Texas, survival depended on community. But for the Morrisons, community had shifted into suspicion and faith into fear. What remained was not fellowship, but distance and invisible boundary, drawn with every bowed head and every cautious glance. The Morrison farm lay 3 miles off the county road, its fields bordered by barbed wire and dust-choked mesquite. By day, it looked no different from the hundreds of other homesteads left brittle by drought. But neighbors remembered what they saw at night. In the summer of 1953, unmarked cars began to appear on the dirt track leading to the Morrison gate. Headlights extinguished before they crested the hill. Engines hummed low and deliberate, like a signal meant for those awake to hear. The vehicles bore no county plates. Their tires were newer than any farmer's truck. Their silhouettes square and official. Men stepped out in pressed suits despite the heavy heat, their movements precise, their posture unmistakably military. Some witnesses swore they caught the glint of insignia when doors opened, the faint outline of uniforms beneath jackets. Fort Hood lay less than 100 miles away, and in those years its soldiers moved often under the wide banner of national security. But what business could they have with a quiet farming family in the middle of a drought? No one dared ask aloud. Accounts gathered decades later describe the same quiet ritual. The cars would stop at the gate. Morrison men, sometimes joined by the Reverend himself, would walk out to meet them. And there, under the dry Texas moon, words were exchanged that no neighbor could quite hear. Only the sound of crickets, the rustle of dry grass, and the uneasy thought that something larger than the drought had come to settle over the Morrison land. There were no raised voices, no sound of struggle, only the quiet grammar of bodies, shoulders bowed hats, held in restless hands, conversations that ended with one figure turning back toward the farmhouse and the other driving away into the dark. A single ledger entry in the sheriff's office confirms at least one of those visits. A deputy patrolling the outer county roads noted 2 dark sedans lingering near the Morrison farm well past midnight. No official report was filed, no follow-up recorded. The entry itself ends with a line scratched through, as though someone decided the detail was better forgotten. The timing made the unease heavier. The visitors always came when the county slipped into blackout power outages that left houses dark and radios silent for lack of current. In those hours, the only witnesses were farmers awake to check dying livestock or mothers rocking restless infants in the heat. They told their children to stay away from the windows to let the headlights pass without notice. Fear spread not from anything spoken, but from the certainty that something was being commanded, something no one could refuse. Can you imagine that kind of quiet when obedience arrives, not as threat, but as inevitability? Years later, a nurse who had long since left the county spoke of hospital files quietly collected by federal men. They came with papers stamped and signed authorizations that no one dared to question. They opened cabinets, removed ledgers, and left behind only the echo of empty drawers. She remembered their faces calm, almost disinterested, but their presence carried a pressure that silenced protest before it could rise. To a community already brittle with drought and whispers of curses, the arrival of government cars turned folklore into something colder. Folklore might frighten children. These men frightened everyone. No one called them by name, for no one knew their names. They were simply the visitors, and their presence shifted the Morrison mystery from private sorrow into the shadow of national secrecy. On the farm, lights burned long after midnight visits. Curtains stayed drawn. The family's movements grew slower, more guarded. Whatever was spoken in those dark encounters, it bent the Morrisons into silence. And silence in those years was the most telling evidence of all. Once the history of a family in rural Texas could be traced as easily as a finger across paper. Birth certificates typed on onion skin sheets, baptism entries penned in the neat cursive of parish ledgers, death notices clipped into courthouse files. All these were the scaffolding of memory. But for the Morrisons, that scaffolding began to collapse one record at a time. The first discrepancy surfaced in the county clerk's office in late 1953. A routine request for a certified birth record returned only a blank space in the index. The child's name, once written, clearly had been scratched out in heavy ink, leaving a scar on the page. When a second clerk pulled the original file, the envelope was empty. Notes in the margin offered only a single phrase: transferred destination unlisted. No explanation followed. Church records soon mirrored the gaps. The parish baptismal book, bound in cracked leather and handled for decades with reverence, showed careful attendance until the early 50s. Then entire entries vanished. Pages once filled with names had been sliced out with a blade so sharp it left no fray. Only the numbering of the folios remained skipping forward, as if the children themselves had never been christened. Parish correspondence preserved in diocesan archives mentions the loss, but only in muted terms. Several pages misplaced. Efforts at recovery unsuccessful. Hospitals told a similar story. Admissions registers for the summer of 1952, when the first Morrison child was delivered, bear abrupt interruptions. A sequence of numbered entries jumps without explanation, the missing lines matching the dates of Morrison deliveries. One nurse later recalled being instructed to tidy the books, though she refused to say by whom. Pressed further, she admitted that ledgers had been collected during unannounced visits and returned with sections carefully removed. School rosters rarely listed the Morrison children. Census counts underreported the household. What fragments survive exist only because they were duplicated elsewhere. A faded newspaper notice of a land deed transfer, a single photograph annotated with a birth year. Yet even these scraps raise suspicion as though they escaped erasure by accident rather than intention. To examine the archive today is to encounter silence disguised as order. Cabinets once labeled Morrison stand empty, their contents untraceable. Church vaults contain ledgers with deliberate gaps, each excised page a quiet denial of presence. Have you ever stood in a room of missing records where the absence itself seems louder than any written word? That is where the Morrison story waits in the hush between pages where memory has been scraped away. But the unease remains. The absence itself becomes evidence, not just a gap, but a fingerprint of intent. A family methodically removed from the written memory of a community. No county official ever admitted to the omissions. The clerk merely noted that records have been consolidated. The parish offered no answer beyond misplaced folios. The hospital cited routine archiving. Each explanation sounded tidy, but none explained why only one family's history had thinned to almost nothing. It is one thing to inherit a curse whispered from pulpit and porch. It is another to watch the proof of your own existence stolen from the page. For the Morrisons' absence became the most haunting record of all. By the mid-1950s, the household had grown larger, but the expansion did not bring stability. Each new birth seemed to carry the family further into shadow. Parish ledgers list fewer details with each entry, as if even the act of writing had become dangerous. Where once names and dates stood in careful ink, later children appear only by initials or are marked simply infant baptized condition, uncertain. The few medical notes that survive faint carbons, buried among unrelated files, chart a troubling progression. One child presented with elongated limbs and a chest too narrow for easy breathing. Another born 2 years later survived only 3 days before succumbing to seizures that baffled the staff. A third lived into adolescence but showed what doctors described as violent disturbances of temperament, long silences interrupted by sudden unpredictable aggression. The records use clinical terms, catatonia hysteria, dissociative fugue, but together they form a portrait of decline. Neighbors interviewed decades later spoke of children glimpsed at windows who vanished before greetings could be offered. Some remembered small graves behind the homestead, unmarked but freshly turned. Others insisted that certain children had been sent away under escort. Their destination never revealed. Census data from 1960 deepens the uncertainty. The Morrison household is listed with fewer occupants than eyewitness accounts confirm, suggesting either deliberate omission or disappearances no one would acknowledge. The town's attitude hardened in proportion to the family's suffering. Farmers passing the Morrison gate would not meet the eyes of children lingering near the fence line. At school, seats meant for Morrison pupils remained empty by year's end, marked simply withdrawn, no forwarding address. Teachers who dared to inquire found their questions deflected. One noted in her log spoke to county officials, advised to leave the matter alone. Even within the church, once a reluctant refuge, their presence thinned. By 1957, the Morrisons no longer filled the front pew, but scattered along the edges, their numbers shifting without explanation. When asked to present their children for confirmation, The family demurred, citing illness or absence. Rumors filled the void. That some offspring never drew breath. That others were kept indoors to hide deformities. That a few had been taken by the very men who visited at night. Archival fragments from hospital correspondence hint at outside intervention. One surviving letter from a county physician to the State Health Board notes a pattern of hereditary abnormality in the Morrison line, then breaks off the bottom half of the page, torn away. No response is recorded. The absence of follow-up suggests less oversight than removal. What emerges from these scattered testimonies is not a simple tale of illness, but of erasure. Children appear and vanish, documented one year and gone the next. Their traces scrubbed from official accounts. What should have been the natural branching of a family tree became instead a withering. Each limb cut short before it could bear fruit. The Morrison bloodline continued, but only in fragments diminished, unstable, increasingly hidden. By the close of the decade, a household once marked by promise had become a family, whispered about as if it were already fading from existence. Among the scattered testimonies surrounding the Morrison case, one document carries a weight unlike any other: the private journal of a nurse who served in the Amarillo polio ward during the height of the epidemic. For decades, she worked quietly, her name appearing only in payroll slips and hospital rosters. But near the end of her life, confined to a convalescent home in the late 1970s, she began writing entries on yellowed stationery, the ink wavering but legible. These pages, preserved by a relative after her death, now stand as a rare voice from inside the machinery of secrecy. Her words begin, clinically recounting the daily routines of the ward rows of children confined to iron-lung staff, exhausted by endless shifts. The mechanical hiss of forced breath filling every corridor. But woven into those observations are mentions of a different set of patients, delivered not through normal admissions, but by unmarked transport. She describes a family line with unusual presentation children whose conditions bore no relation to polio, yet who were treated inside the facility under orders from officials she could not name. The way she writes it, you can almost hear the machines, the steady rhythm of artificial lungs, and in the background, the faint arrival of children whose very presence was never meant to be written down. Some stories are written not only by what is present, but also by what is gone. In Amarillo County, record's absence itself becomes a form of evidence, a vivid impression of a family, seemingly erased stroke by stroke from the collective memory. No official ever acknowledged this. The county archivist left a brief note: records consolidated. The church claimed the books were lost. The hospital responded with the familiar phrase, routine archiving. But how could such explanations assuage the unease when a single family, the Morrisons, had been so obliterated that it was almost as if they had never existed? Have you ever wondered what could be more terrifying than a curse passed from pulpit and porch? Perhaps it was the moment you discovered that the evidence of your existence had been deliberately stolen. For the Morrison family, that absence became the most haunting record. By the mid-1950s, the Morrisons' numbers had increased, but overcrowding did not bring stability. With each new baby, the darkness seemed to deepen. The parish baptismal records began to thin out. Names and birth dates once recorded in full were now just letters, sometimes with the chilling note, baptismal status unknown. Medical notes scattered in unfamiliar files revealed a string of abnormalities. One child was born with unusually long legs and a chest too narrow to breathe easily. 2 years later, another lived for only 3 days, dying in fits of convulsions that doctors could not explain. The third grew up, but exhibited sudden violent outbursts interspersed with long, chilling silences. The reports were all clinical catatonia, hysteria, dissociative fugue, but taken together, they painted a fragmented portrait of genetic decay. Neighbors later recounted occasional glimpses of the Morrison children standing behind windows. But they vanished before they could say hello. Some remembered small, fresh-soiled graves behind the farmhouse. Others insisted that some had been taken somewhere in the night, their destination never revealed. The 1960 census data added to the mystery. The Morrisons' population was far smaller than what the neighborhood had witnessed. Was it an oversight or an unacknowledged disappearance? The town's attitude gradually changed. Farmers passing the Morrison gate avoided the gaze of the children leaning against the fence. At school, their children's seats were gradually left empty until the end of the year. The registration section had only one line: withdrawal, no address left. Teachers who tried to inquire were advised, don't interfere. Even in church, which had been their reluctant refuge, their presence dwindled. By 1957, the Morrisons were no longer sitting in the front pews, but were scattered in the back pews, their numbers changing unpredictably. When asked to bring their children to be confirmed, they refused, citing illness or absence. Rumors quickly filled the void. Some say some children died before they could breathe. Others whisper that some were hidden in the house because of deformities. There are even whispers of strange visitors coming at night, taking some away forever. Fragments of medical archives reveal signs of outside intervention. A surviving letter from the county doctor to the state health department mentions a pattern of hereditary abnormalities in the Morrison family. Then stops abruptly. The bottom half of the letter has been torn out. No response. No follow-up report. As if it were not a lack of supervision but a deliberate removal. Among the murky pile of documents, one record carries special weight: the private diary of a nurse who worked at the Amarillo polio ward during the years of the outbreak. She served in obscurity for decades, her name appearing only on payrolls and shift lists. But toward the end of her life, while in a nursing home in the late 1970s, she began to write tremulous lines on yellowed paper. A rare voice from inside the secret machine. The first pages were filled with routine work rows of children lying motionless in iron lungs. Staff exhausted from endless shifts, the mechanical sound of each breath echoing through the hallways. But hidden among the regular lines were passages about another group of patients brought in not through the usual admission process, but via unmarked transports. She described a family with unusual symptoms. Children who did not have polio, but were treated inside the facility on the orders of nameless officials. She recounted being summoned to locked rooms completely separate from the main ward, where the Morrison children lay silently under close observation. Some stared for hours without blinking. Older children did not cry, only hummed low, creepy sounds. The doctors who examined them did not wear any hospital badges, but their voices and looks were enough to impose orders. Between the lines, the coercion was evident. She was ordered to leave the Morrison name blank in her nursing records. When she objected, She was told that the remaining entries would be filled in elsewhere. She later discovered that all her notes had disappeared. I was warned. She wrote that my duty was to care, not to ask questions. The warning she implied came with consequences far greater than losing my job. Some colleagues abruptly transferred jobs, leaving no address. A nurse disappears after daring to pry into the vest-clad visitors. As she finishes, her tone shifts from note-taking to confessional. I saw, and I was silent. May God forgive my silence. She doesn't elaborate on what she saw, leaving only fragments. Strange instruments repeated, blood draws car trips, to pick up children and never return. Even in confession, memories are blocked by an invisible force. When the diary was found after her death, her family hesitated for a long time before publishing it, fearing scandal. Only copies survive, but the original disappeared. Yet, even if it's incomplete, it's the clearest evidence yet that Morrison's story isn't just legend or rumor, but something witnessed firsthand and then suppressed in fear. And then, amid the seemingly insignificant brown boxes of files in the National Archives, another trace was found. Scattered among the declassified files in the 1990s, these documents were like paper shadows, passages heavily blacked out, signatures missing. What remained was enough to evoke the shadow of a project that had never been allowed to be made public. A memo dated 1952 mentions field studies on West Texas populations showing unusual genetic expression. The author's name is erased. The address is crossed out. The margin is stamped, eyes only. Project clearance required. Another document links the research to Amarillo Air Force Base, known for its nuclear weapons assembly. It's puzzling to see genetic research appear alongside reports of nuclear capabilities. The following year's budgets listed huge expenditures under vague headings: emergency medical plans, population monitoring far beyond the needs of rural clinics. In the margins, handwritten notes quietly mentioned civilian cooperation, but there were no names. It was as if individuals had been deliberately erased, leaving only abstract nouns. Researchers who have looked through these files say that the gaps are the most powerful evidence. During the Cold War, federal agencies rarely wasted resources on useless phenomena. If genetic anomalies appeared alongside reports of nuclear readiness, it was not out of curiosity, but with a purpose. There are files that don't reveal their scope, but each fragment reveals a cold way of thinking. Families are treated as data points, rural communities as living laboratories. A letter that remains deepens the unease. Sent from a federal research office to the Army Medical Department, it requests routine samples for comparative analysis. What kind of samples? The key text is completely blacked out. Only the closing line remains intact as a cold command. Hurry. Stability on the ground depends on the ability to maintain secrecy. There is no record of Morrison's name appearing in these files. Yet, the timing of these dispatches coincides unsettlingly with the years when the Morrison family suffered the most. Phrases like genetic expression are the same language Dr. Harland struggled to articulate in his notes. The geography matches two rural counties, just a drive from Amarillo. The same ones the nurse once described as having unmarked patient vans enter and exit at night. These files offer no answers. They leave only blank spaces. Names are erased, text obscured, context lost. Yet, it is precisely that absence that becomes the most powerful testimony. What should have been clear medical research now resembles the architecture of a cover-up, a project, funded, a population, targeted, and a history rewritten until only black ink blots cover the page. By the turn of the 21st century, the remnants of Morrison's bloodline are so rare that they can be counted on one hand. Marriage records were sparse, census, population lines were blank, gravestones were obscured beyond reading. And yet, a few descendants quietly survived the storm of obliteration. From one of those descendants, a person who had left Texas, living quietly elsewhere, a DNA sample was taken. The person had donated the sample voluntarily, solely for genealogical research, unaware that he was opening a terrifying door. The initial testing process was no different than hundreds of thousands of other samples. Centrifugation, extraction, sequencing. Machines translated each drop of blood into genetic code strings of nucleotides, lined up neatly, as precise as clockwork. At first, everything seemed normal. The familiar signs of a mix of European and Native American origins reflected Texas's migration history. But as we delved deeper, anomalies began to emerge. In the report, the scientists used careful phrases: non-standard sequence, unusual repeat, expansion, unclassified structural variant. These were phrases designed to describe without explaining, to acknowledge the data without implying it. Yet in the margin of one page, one researcher had written by hand. Not an error, too consistent. Just below, another circled a segment of the sequence and wrote a single word: intentional. The anomalies were not isolated mutations, but recurring motifs, like echoes in an endless hallway. They formed structured patterns too orderly to be random errors, yet they had never appeared in any medical literature. The motifs suggested intervention, not natural evolution. Geneticists, accustomed to seeing variation as a product of time, were now staring at genetic signatures that looked like deliberate implantation. In the lab notes, a sense of anxiety gradually overshadowed the scientific language. A shaky line read, "Construct is technical origin unknown." Another warned, "Do not publish without historical context. The consequences are too serious." Even as the machines repeatedly confirmed the results, the scientists hesitated, seemingly afraid of what they were seeing. When compared to a global database, the strangeness became even more apparent. The vast majority of the human genome spanned thousands of years of history, but Morrison's sample contained gaps with no known counterparts. The gaps either came from a previously unrecorded population or from an intervention beyond normal genetics. Both possibilities were equally frightening. The descendant was told only briefly, "The results are inconclusive." Not a word about the abnormalities. Not a word that their DNA contained symbols that no other living people shared. The silence was entirely intentional. The researchers had chosen not to burden a single individual with a discovery that could shake the history of humanity. Looking back at the lab records, one senses a strange duality: precise tables, sharp electrophoresis, images, meticulous statistical charts. But in between are hasty scribbled notes. This is not a natural mutation. Check military archives. Not for publication. Science still speaks the language of caution, but beneath the veneer beats fear. If genetics is a story written in blood, then Morrison's genome is like a chapter that someone has sneaked in. The data was more than a family record. It was like a pre-programmed message, a warning embedded in the very code of life. Finally, a seemingly trivial Freedom of Information Act request was filed for copies of Texas rural medical records from the 1950s. Months passed without a response. Then suddenly, a thin envelope arrived. Inside were photocopies so blackened they looked like paper shrouds. But at the top of the first page, a phrase had escaped the censor's Morrison protocol. The file was less than 20 pages long, and not a single one was intact. The documents were dated, but not signed. The headings were there, the contents were gone. The opening sentences, in a stiff bureaucratic tone, were immediately lost in a long black ink blot. The family is under observation. Then, the blank space swallowed the rest. The results of the investigation show another black strip. Each page is tantalizing, hinting at meaning, then retracting it before it reaches the truth. A final appendix leaves a few fuzzy details. It lists the allocation of funds for civilian cooperation, providing money far beyond the needs of any rural clinic. Yet, not a single hospital reported receiving these transfers. In the margin, a smudged note still reads, "Data consolidation." Archivists familiar with Cold War jargon immediately recognize it. It's code for confiscating records. Do you sense it? A story where every line, every blank space, every black streak whispered the same message: something happened to the Morrison family. Something too dangerous to be allowed to exist intact on the page. Perhaps the most revealing thing about this story is the pages that no longer exist. In that fragile file, the tiny numbers at the corner of the page suddenly jump from 7 to 11, skipping the 4 middle pages as if they had never been written. Withheld or destroyed, no one knows. But that blank space weighs more than any remaining text. Letters sent for clarification received only a repeated reply printed on invitation paper that was as cold as stone. There are no documents that match this request. A denial wrapped in administrative text, gentle, but like a door that is forever closed. Those who have been allowed to see the file speak of a paradox. The more it is hidden, the more it betrays itself. A typical medical survey, no matter how intrusive, would not require blacking out every line, erasing every name. Only research marked top secret would be buried so thoroughly. And if someone tried to erase it, it meant there was something they wanted to bury so deeply that history would never find it. The rest of the text was even colder than the silence. This subject should not be pursued. Restricted exposure recommended. The seemingly administrative notes carried the weight of a warning, not the language of medicine but of cover-up. No index linked the Morrison protocol to other projects. Not a single file survived explaining what it was for. But that very absence suggests a shadowy picture, a plan conceived in the dark, carried out under the pretext of Cold War urgency. Then dismantled, erased only a title page accidentally escaping the censorship net. Perhaps the Morrison protocol was never meant to exist. It was not allowed to appear in the archives, not allowed to escape the layers of encryption. Yet, like a lingering breath, the name is still there, lurking among the black spaces and the truncated pages. The final interview took place in a modest living room, the curtains drawn despite the midday sun. The woman in front of the recorder was 74 years old, had long since taken her husband's name, but her bloodline was unmistakable. Her voice was small, broken, her hands clasped tightly together. The transcript was not a confession, but a breath of survival. The voice of the last Morrison descendant dared to speak. She began with memories of her childhood where silence hung like an invisible wall. She remembered being told never to mention her siblings at school, but no one would tell her why. Old photos were removed from albums, leaving blank corners. When she asked about relatives, her parents just looked away. It was like I grew up in a house of ghosts, she whispered, with shadows that no one dared to name. Illness followed her throughout her adolescence. Sudden fainting spells, unexplained fevers, and dreams so vague they blurred with reality. In those dreams, voices called softly from the corner of the room, inviting her to follow. Doctors offered a variety of diagnoses: epilepsy, neurosis, anxiety. But none lasted long. Every year it was a different name, she says, but the illness remained the same. The haunting wasn't just physical. She remembers the avoiding looks of neighbors, the hesitation of teachers to call her name, and the strange advice of a local priest. There are things in the blood that are better left unsaid. The pressure of being different, of a family name that the community avoided, weighed on her even as an adult. Marriage gave her a new family name, but the past did not let her go. She had 2 miscarriages each time the doctors said it was normal. But in her heart, she could not quell the question: is the Morrison curse still haunting her? The 2 surviving children are now adults, but both refuse to mention the Morrison name. They know, she whispered, even though I never told them. They see in me, and they are silent. Nightmares still cling to her like breath. She wakes in the middle of the night with only vague memories. Figures standing by her bed, the sound of babies crying from non-existent rooms, and the feeling of being watched. Medical tests found nothing. She keeps those details to herself, afraid of what her grandchildren will think if they know. Her story is full of unanswered questions. Why us? Was it blood? Or was it something that was introduced into the blood? She didn't say the word experiment, but her silences whispered it. She confessed to reading about Cold War experiments, about shadowy government projects, and had a hunch that the mysterious visits, the lost childhood records, couldn't be coincidence. But she couldn't say for sure. What she feared most wasn't the past, but heredity. I look at my grandchildren, she said quietly, and wonder, what have I passed on to them if it's in their blood? What will they become? Her eyes gleamed with a mixture of pain and helplessness, but no tears fell. She looked at the floor as if the answer was already etched there, just unreadable to humans. The recording stopped abruptly. She asked to be turned off. The silence that followed was heavier than the words, a silence that accumulated over generations, bound to a name that history had tried but never managed to erase. In recent years, those who have tried to piece together Morrison's history have encountered a series of obstacles so strange they seem almost coincidental. Archivators, genealogists, independent researchers, all have encountered a familiar pattern. Documents that appear and disappear. Conversations interrupted by strange phone calls or stalking glances. Evidence that was about to come together, suddenly erased at the most crucial moment. Have you ever wondered if history can be blacked out? Pages cut out. How many stories like that of the Morrison family are quietly sleeping under the dust of time, waiting for someone patient enough and brave enough to listen? The first sign wasn't a specific discovery but a blank. It emerged from the parish microfilm rolls where baptismal and marriage records had been kept for generations. When researchers ordered the rolls from the diocesan archives, they received something strange. The portion of the film that was supposed to cover the period from 1952 to 1957 had been replaced by blank tape. An endless silence, no images, no text. Requests for replacements were met with only standard replies insisting, "No such roll exists." What was even more frightening was that just a week later, even the original archive index had been edited, erasing any trace of the rolls that had been listed. The district court repeated the same strange rhythm. A signed file had been borrowed for copying, but when returned, only innocuous land papers remained. The necessary documents had vanished as if they had never existed. The court staff looked surprised, only to suggest that perhaps the file had been misfiled decades ago. But throughout the search, no trace was found anywhere else. A researcher who had kept meticulous records of the event found her personal hard drive wiped clean. The files containing her notes had been replaced with distorted, unreadable symbols. It was not a power outage, not a software error, it was a form of intentional disappearance. The shadow of surveillance silently followed anyone who dared to touch the story. One young researcher collecting accounts from nurses who had worked at the hospital involved repeatedly found unmarked cars parked outside her house after each interview. Another reported that her phone would ring in the middle of the night with only long silences punctuated by occasional static noises. And strangely, all of these phenomena only ended when they abandoned their research. Even efforts that made it to the publication stage were not spared by this invisible hand. A regional journal had accepted a paper linking the Morrison case to Cold War medical research. Before going to print, the paper was abruptly withdrawn. The editor gave only a vague reason external reviewer concerns. There was no further explanation, nor was the identity of the reviewer disclosed. The manuscript disappeared from the journal's system as if it had never existed. Most disturbing were the losses in private collections. A box of old photos belonging to a family who had lived next door to the Morrisons was loaned for digitization. The scans were completed, but when the box was returned, the only photograph of the Morrison children was missing. The family denied taking the photo, and the archivist insisted that it had not been lost. The photo and possibly the stories behind it remained as an unexplained void. Each incident taken individually might be considered a coincidence, a minor error, but when put together, they form a structure of systematic obstruction. Evidence is erased, witnesses are silenced, researchers are followed until they have to leave. It is not just the destruction of a story. It is the refusal to let it exist in the first place. In archives, in old houses, in invisible eyes, silently observing Morrison's story seems to protect itself. It allows a few fragments to rise to the surface, just enough to remind us that there is something else beneath, and then quickly withdraws them back into the darkness. The silence gradually becomes louder than the words, and the gaps begin to speak louder than the remaining records. The investigation seems to be eating away at itself. Each step forward left fewer traces than the last, as if history had learned to hide its shadow. What remained were fragments, fragmentary, vague, and increasingly dangerous to anyone who dared to continue following. Then one day, the church vault door slammed shut. The restoration work was finished. The workers had left, and the Morrison box was returned to the shadows. The authorities explained the resealing as a way to preserve the fragile documents from dust and light. But those who witnessed the box being lowered into the ground saw something else. It was not preservation. It was a burial. The investigation spanned decades, picking up bits and pieces of clues, empty parish films, missing hospital records, a nurse's trembling confession, pages blackened by secret marks. Each detail hinted at something larger, but when put together, they refused to form a complete picture. Each answer dissolved into a void. Each clue ended in silence or a locked door. What remained was not a conclusion but a pattern of erasure so deliberate it could not be called random, but lacking the facts to decipher. In the towns where the Morrisons had lived, the name was still spoken with reserve. Farmers might talk about the drought years, but when asked about the family who had survived them, they would pause, look down, and say they were different. And then they disappeared. No one said more. Silence became the most faithful witness. Traces of family remain in small irregularities. Land records that skip a generation census pages, that don't match the actual number school lists, with gaps that no one bothers to explain. To outsiders, they're just administrative errors. But to locals, they mark the boundary of a story too dangerous to repeat. Even descendants who bear no trace of the mysterious disease live in fear. Some refuse DNA tests, fearing the secrets will be revealed. Others refuse all interviews, saying simply, there are things that should never be brought up again. The fear has shifted from the body to the memory, from visible distortions to invisible hauntings. The curse, if it exists at all, is no longer present in blood and bones, but resides in the reticence to name it. The vault under the church is now more than just an archive. It is a monument to unfinished history, a box of questions no one intends to answer. Its weight lies not just in the stone that covers it, but in the decision of an entire community to bury the box twice, as if they too feared what it held. Researchers continue to circle the story, but the motif remains the same. Files disappear, testimonies contradict, evidence shatters into unconnected fragments. The story refuses any attempt at closure, as if the very act of pursuing it feeds the silence that follows. The Morrison family's shadow stretches across time, refusing to end, refusing to rest. And so the investigation ends exactly where it began, with a vault under a Texas church, its heavy door shut, and its contents filled with documents, both known and feared. Above ground, the drought is over. The fields are green again. But in the whispers of the locals, the name Morrison still hangs like a fine dust that never settles. The vault has been sealed, but its shadow has never left Texas.